I told teachers that we weren't going to use the terminology marking anymore. We were going to call it feedback, because as soon as you say marking, that was an expectation that there was going to be an actual physical mark in the book, and that wasn't necessarily what was going to have the most impact on children's learning.
Hello, I'm Tom Rogers and this is the Rebel Education Podcast. This is a brand new podcast aimed at reflecting what's really happening in educational institutions in the United Kingdom and beyond. In each podcast, we're going to be talking about the particular challenges that educators are facing on the ground, and they're going to tell us what's really happening. In each episode, we're going to hear from leaders in education who are going to hopefully offer solutions to some of those problems and challenges. I will be your host. I'm Tom Rogers. I'm a TES columnist and history teacher in Vigo, Spain. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you can find me at Rogers History or visit my website at rogershistory.com. This podcast is going to be a must listen. We aren't going to sugarcoat anything. This is going to be as real as it gets. I'm absolutely delighted that you've chosen to spend a bit of time with me, and I promise I'll try and be nice. If you want to buy me a drink or support the upkeep of this podcast, then please check out the Patreon link attached on the Podbean page. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to the Rebel Education Podcast. This week we are discussing one of the biggest issues in education today, and that is teacher workload. It's the key reason why teachers are leaving the profession, and in this episode we are going to discuss what schools right at the cutting edge are doing to reduce workload today. We're also going to have the benefit of talking to some school leaders to talk about what they're doing in their schools, including Georgina Young, who is the head teacher of a school in Cambridgeshire. This is a podcast aimed at anybody who is looking to reduce their own workload, but also anyone involved in education who is looking to do that for the people who work for them. So to start with, what are schools actually doing in general right now to reduce workload? One of the first things that a lot of schools are doing is they are centralising detentions. We all know that chasing students and operating detentions during breaks and lunches and after school takes quite a lot of time, especially for the newer teacher who has to do that to stamp their authority. They can't afford to let a detention roll. They have to follow it up. Now, in a lot of schools still, teachers are responsible for their own detentions. They're responsible for setting them. They're responsible for actually running the detention. And then they're responsible for chasing it up if the student doesn't turn up. A lot of schools now are taking all of those three things out of the hands of classroom teachers. The detentions are set on a timetable, so either a member of the senior leadership team, a member of the support staff, or even sometimes it's just on a rota of the staff themselves, so they only run one detention a week, for example. And literally during lessons, a teacher just clicks the name of the student on the register, enters the description as to why the detention's been issued, probably in Sims, and then whoever is at that detention for that day checks the list, see if they turn up. If they don't turn up, then it is not that teacher's responsibility to chase it up. Again, SLT, take ownership of chasing students for detentions, and no after school detentions are run by teachers. It is unashamedly taking detentions out of teachers' hands, and it saves a lot of time. Another big thing that schools are doing at the moment to reduce workload is embracing all forms of feedback. Because currently we are at a place where written feedback has dominated. It has dominated for probably the last 20 years in terms of the feedback that Ofsted have expected to see, that schools have just kind of taken as a given that that's the way forward, that's what they need to do. And of course, evidencing. There are still so many teachers out there fiddling around with green and purple pens, sticking in different sheets for students, producing sheets just so they can be checked by somebody else, but actually never seen or acted on by students. These things are still happening every day in a lot of schools around, never mind the United Kingdom, around Europe. Not only is this not evidence-based, but it's also creating an inordinate amount of time. Whole class feedback sheets have really revolutionized the way that written marking has been done. Just to put it in a nutshell, you would take a set of 30 books in, you would look through each book. You have a sheet where it would have different sections in, for example, common misconceptions. And then when you're going through the 30 books and just looking at them, you would note down on that one single sheet what the most common misconceptions were of the work that you were looking at. For example, 5 or 6 students have misunderstood the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, or whatever it might be. That gets written on there. You then might have common spelling, punctuation and grammar mistakes. You then might have class targets, whatever, right, on this one sheet. And then once you've been through all the books, it might take you 30 minutes, I don't know, to go through, say, 25 books without writing any comments, and you're just writing it on this one sheet. You would then photocopy that sheet 30 times, give it to students, they put it in the books, they hopefully read on it, they hopefully act on it. Of course, there has been a debate over the weekend, I think started by Michael Tidd, who's a primary head teacher, on Twitter, saying, well, if you're filling in this sheet, that's all well and good, but don't use it as evidence. Don't ask teachers for that sheet. I think Simon Smith mentioned that as well, which I think is a really good point. Nothing should be to do, very little should be to do with evidencing. It should be to do with impact on students and doing what needs to be done for the kids and not really for anybody else. And of course, the upshot of that is that more time can then be spent on planning, more time can be spent on resourcing, the important things for actually teaching lessons. The other thing is verbal feedback. And I'm of the opinion that the most effective feedback is in the moment with the student, sitting with their work and actually talking to them. It can have a huge impact straight away. It's very difficult to evidence it. And of course, we used to have the verbal feedback stamp. It's kind of gone out of fashion now. It's been ridiculed and people have stopped using it. But of course, people used to stamp the work and say, verbal feedback given. Well, who are you stickering that for? I mean, it's not the student. They know you've just given them feedback because you've just spoken to them. So it's an evidencing tool. And again, something that a lot of schools have now left behind. But verbal feedback, crucial. And feedback instead of marking. I know that's Victoria Hewitt, Mrs. Humanities on Twitter, has been a great proponent of this idea that we should be doing more feedback, less marking. And there's lots and lots of different ways you can do that. I would suggest checking out her blog, mrshumanities.com. If you can go there are so many strategies that you can use to give feedback that really doesn't take that amount of time. The other thing that a lot of schools are doing to reduce workload is promoting direct instruction as a tool for delivery in lessons, chalk and talk. We have got to a place where there is this culture, has been this culture of jazz hands, produce incredible amounts of resources for a single lesson, differentiate, make 3 versions of a worksheet, card sorts when it could just be a tick of a box, all of these different things. Now, some of it I think is valuable. If you're engaging students, if you want to really engage them in a particular lesson or topic, then yeah, put some work into resourcing for sure. But as a general rule, chalk and talk has been lambasted at times, and that has also been to the detriment on teacher workload, because really this is about relying on teacher expertise. This is about saying the teacher can deliver a lesson using their own expertise, using questioning from the front, and it can be just as effective, if not more effective, than a lesson that involves the students playing a much more active and individual role. Now, for me, I'm a great believer in variety. I'm a great believer in a mixture, but I think it's fair to say that direct instruction has not been promoted. There are some schools now who are embracing it, who are saying this can be the way forward for us, and fair play to them for doing that. Personally, I believe in a mix, but there's no doubt that direct instruction can reduce teacher workload as long as teachers are given a little bit of time to, if you like, build up their subject knowledge, which I think is crucial for direct instruction, and to practice it, without interruption. Other things that schools are doing, using comparative judgment to mark things. This is according to Daisy Christodoulou, who is one of the great, if you like, proponents of comparative judgment. She says comparative judgment offers a solution to the problem of assessing tasks such as essays and projects. Instead of writing prescriptive mark schemes, training markers in their use, getting them to mark a batch of essays or tasks, then come back together to moderate, comparative judgment simply asks an examiner to make a series of judgments about pairs of tasks. And this is a trend sweeping schools, and one that I believe can have a really positive consequence on teachers looking to reduce their workload. And she actually gives an example in one of her blogs, Daisy Christodoulou. Take the example of an essay on Romeo and Juliet. With comparative judgment, the examiner looks at 2 essays and decides which one is better. Then they look at another pair and decide which one is better out of those, and so on. And it's relatively quick and easy to make such judgments, much easier and quicker than marking one individual essay. I know that I spoke to Shelley Baker, who is head of raising standards at a school in the south of England. She's been using comparative judgment with her year 11. She managed to reduce her marking commitment massively and also provide opportunities for the students to actually talk about their writing. So there's no doubt that comparative judgment could have a big role in the future in terms of marking. Again, minimal data drops. A lot of schools are reducing the amount of times they're going to ask teachers to input data into a computer. Most now are trying to limit that to 1.5 term, sometimes maybe in less than that. But I certainly believe that personally, the less time that teachers are spending at a computer inputting numbers is time taken away from planning, resourcing, giving feedback. So for me, again, that's what a lot of schools are looking at, different ways around collecting data and also looking at the value of it. You're collecting a bunch of data. It might look good on a spreadsheet, but what's the value? What do those numbers mean? What is behind it? Another thing is co-planning. Some schools are giving much more time now for colleagues to sit down with each other to plan together and create shared areas and things like Dropbox or Google Classroom or Edmodo or whatever it is. All of these different software to provide places where teachers can collaborate and share resources easily. It can have a massive impact on teacher workload, of course, if you have a lesson plan for you. There are some schools actually now who are providing an entire, not just a scheme of work, but everything to teach the lesson, because they've given staff time to develop that together and then they just provide it to staff. I think that's a big thing and a real bonus. Also, I think a lot of schools now are starting to strip down on accountability measures. There has been this excessive accountability, which has led to, one-off lesson observations. And we've realised that one-off lesson observations, actually, even in terms of the feedback for staff, don't have a massive impact on teachers in terms of making them better. So what's the point in doing it? Obviously, it's a developmental tool, and I think it's hugely important for PGCE students and even NQTs. But as a method of judgment, not so sure. And that means that, every time you do a one-off lesson observation or a lesson observation that's 25 minutes of a lesson, the natural thing is that teachers are going to think about that. It doesn't matter what extra work they do, they're going to think about it. It's going to dominate their mind the day before or even the week before, if they know it's coming up. Again, work scrutinies, starting to move away from every page of a book having to have green ink over it or stickers on it or something written in it or whatever. A lot of schools are trying to move away from that now, again, with workload being the highest reason to do so, but also looking at the impact of these practices. Fewer forms to fill in, less data for the sake of data, less excessive accountability. This is the way a lot of schools on the front line are going. Another one that some schools are just starting to do now is flexible time during PPAs, allowing teachers to go home if they have a free last lesson, allowing teachers to come in late if they have a free period 1 and their registration class can be covered. It may seem silly, but I think this can have a big impact. If you want to have a rest, go home at lunchtime or just after lunch or whatever. It's an hour or 2 hours earlier than normal, and then you could do your work later on at night. You're feeling more refreshed. You get a better night's sleep. It can have a real big impact on the way teachers feel about their workload. It doesn't necessarily reduce it, but it helps in the way they feel about it and the way they can plan around it. So I think flexible PPAs, flexible working hours, really, really good. And also email off periods. I mean, it's not a solution, but I think, again, it might help to have times where emails are not sent or not included in correspondence. So that's a list of things that a lot of schools are doing to cut workload today. And you may have opinions on each of them. Please do share them with me. Please tweet me at Rogers History. Subscribe to the podcast on Podbean, the Rebel Education Podcast. And please share your thoughts on my website. I've got like a message board on there now where you can share your comments on any podcast that you listen to. That's what a lot of schools are doing. What I want to do now is I want to hear from some school leaders. So we're going to start by listening to Georgina. The value in what she says here is absolutely brilliant. So fascinating to hear the journey she's gone on through 3 Ofsted inspections and through changing the culture around workload in her school. She's a fantastic advocate for doing that. So please give it a listen, and then we'll reconvene once we've heard what Georgina has to say.
The whole thing around workload and about what drives schools really, for me, began, well, way back, actually, before even I was a head. I can remember when I was the school literacy leader, because it was literacy in those days rather than English. I realised that actually if things were not statutory, that you didn't necessarily have to do them. And I remember having some quite heated conversations with the head teacher at the time about the literacy strategy and about actually it wasn't a statutory document, that we didn't have to adopt it all, that we could still teach English in the way that we wanted to teach it, and that actually as long as the children were making progress and getting good results, there was no reason why we had to jump through lots of hoops. So that goes way back to sort of the early 2000s, really, that when we were having those discussions. When I became a head teacher, I began to realise that actually that then was the same on a wider brief. One of the first things that I did when I became head was I had a good look at the timetable and the constriction that provided our school when teachers were continually moaning that they couldn't fit everything in. And it just actually meant that we needed to look at where lunchtime was and could we shift lunchtime. And if we shifted lunchtime and had a longer morning, would that make a difference? Would it mean that we weren't just teaching English and maths in the morning, but we could do other subjects as well, and that might improve things? And so that's what we did. We went ahead and did it, and it made an enormous difference. And that was, I suppose, my first act as a head teacher, where I realised that actually I had some autonomy and I didn't have to necessarily go for approval from the local authority. I did consult with parents on that one. I wouldn't do that necessarily today, but I did have that autonomy, and I could take some leadership decisions with my team, which were basically about improving things for the children ultimately, but certainly for the staff, to ensure that they could do a really good job in the classroom. The culture that we've developed here, and I suppose it's the same, I would hope, in most schools, is that whatever we do here is for the children. The documentation around assessment without levels that was done by the Commission, we really went through that document with a fine-tooth comb, thinking about how assessment without levels was going to impact on our school. Went and listened to Tim Oates speak at that time, and was inspired about actually a system that made sense to me, about not having to drive children up progress ladders, which was in a steep curve, not rushing things, slowing things down, thinking about our teaching, thinking about assessment, and actually looking at the advice that was given in that document, that guidance document, and thinking, yes, that's actually what we're going to do in our school. And that led to us, and when I say us, I mean myself and my leadership team, working with the teaching staff, looking at how we were going to change things, taking the time to look at assessment, and thinking about the systems, policies and practice that we were going to put in place that was going to support that shift in basically teaching and assessment culture, that was going to enable us to have a genuine focus on assessment without levels. And so we did what the document advised. We stopped doing half-termly data drops. We developed a very simple system for tracking, which basically says, are children on track at this point in time in order to achieve what they should achieve by the end of the year. We totally reviewed the assessment policy, and we began to really think about the whole practice around marking. We've never been a triple pen highlighter marking school with pointless feedback, written feedback between teachers and children. That's never been our practice, but we looked at our practice and we reduced it even more, down to the point where I told teachers that we weren't going to use the terminology marking anymore. We were going to call it feedback, because as soon as you say marking, that was an expectation that there was going to be an actual physical mark in the book, and that wasn't necessarily what was going to have the most impact on children's learning. But again, all those discussions were done with staff. We did them over a period of time. We didn't rush things in. We made sure that everybody understood what it was that we were doing and why we were doing it. And again, the conversation came around, who are we marking for? Who are we giving this feedback for? Is it for Ofsted? Is it for parents? Is it for the school leadership team? No, it's absolutely about what is going to drive learning forward the next day. And so that's what drove the policy, not, oh, we've got to have some evidence in our book for Ofsted or any other visitor that's coming into school. It's not about that. So that actually led to a discussion in our school about even the word evidence, and we banned it for a while. In fact, we still don't use that word. I don't want teachers to be producing evidence for me or for anybody else. What I'd like to see is really good quality teaching and learning going on, and we do that in a number of ways, which I'll come on to. But certainly, it's not about producing evidence for me. It's about just doing a good job day to day. Around about that time, again, all this really sort of happened 2015, 2016 is where the main shifts came. We looked at the planning expectation because we were looking at teaching and assessment, and certainly realised that we needed to review how we were planning. We wanted a planning model that was responsive. I did not want teachers to be giving me in planning that they'd spent all weekend doing for the whole week, because more often than not, they were finding, as our assessment for learning really improved, that they would teach something on a Monday and all their week's plans would just go out the window. So what was the point of planning in that way? So we had those discussions, and I said, right, well, I'm not collecting planning in. There's a model that you can use, which is a responsive planning model if you wish, but actually the planning is for you. It's for what you're going to be teaching. How much you write is up to you. If you don't want to write anything, that's up to you. Clearly, if things were going wrong in the classroom, if teaching and learning wasn't on track, obviously that's a different conversation. But I have a set of really experienced teachers who are so creative and so hard-working in terms of thinking that they didn't necessarily need to write it all down. So we stopped having a planning model which was so formal. And it certainly is something that I don't collect in. I don't have the time to read people's planning and comment on it. And why would I be doing that anyway? I'm more interested in actually what's happening day to day in the classroom. Around about that time, or just before, I think, I did a bit of cover in one of the classes. We had somebody who was late back from a maternity leave, and so I stepped in and did some teaching in year 2, which was just an absolute pleasure. But it also made me realise, again, just how much we were expecting of teachers in the classroom, particularly around things like staff meetings. Why were we having a staff meeting every week? When I'd just been teaching for a full day, the last thing I wanted to do was to go and sit in a staff meeting to discuss something, even a staff meeting that I'd planned. You know, I was tired, I had stuff to do for the next day, I wanted to get ready. So it made me rethink the whole thing around staff meetings. So we only have staff meetings now when necessary, but I decided to put something in that enabled us to meet during the school day and give proper time to thinking about the bigger things in education, do the deeper thinking, I suppose. So we put something in called Thinking Tuesdays. They happen every month. I release all the teachers from their classrooms for an hour just before lunch, and we come together and we look at bigger picture stuff. And it gives us time to really think together as a staff and think about whether it's something that we want to do in terms of practice, or maybe it's some reading that we've done around some research that I want people to discuss. But it's giving that time to actually do it, rather than saying, can you come along after school and try and concentrate then. again, no one's said that we need to have a staff meeting every week. There's no dictate anywhere. So why were we doing it? Just because schools have always had staff meetings? Is it the most important thing? Around about that time, we started a staff Facebook group. We do a lot of our communication through that, just basic communication. It's obviously a secret group. But that's helped. We do a weekly briefing on a Friday morning, which is just about what's coming up over the next 3 weeks, and we put a copy of that out for all staff through that Facebook group, and that's revolutionised things. I'm very mindful that we shouldn't be dictating to teachers about how they work and the hours they work. I know that we're all trying to reduce workload, and certainly we've done an awful lot here in order to reduce that. However, there are some teachers here who are out of the building by 4 o'clock, and there are other teachers who will still be here at 5:30. I don't dictate when they should go, or set a time or anything like that, because some people work better in the building, some people work better at home, and that's up to them. I'm out of the building, most days by 5:30 at the latest. I work at home, but I'm not going to be here either jangling keys at people to get out or expecting them to stay later just because I might be staying later. I'm very mindful about planning around school events, so if there's a parents' evening or another event that staff have to come to, then we won't put anything else in during the week. It's not fair. Because actually the biggest commitment is around the teaching and learning for day to day, and I want them to be ready and able to do that. We changed parents' evenings because they used to be 3:30 till about 8 or 9 o'clock at night. We shifted that so they started at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, got cover for teaching staff, and they finish at 6, because by 6 o'clock, actually, after you've been teaching all morning, and then talking to individual parents about their children is exhausting, and if you've got to come back and teach the next day, that's not fair. So 6 o'clock is the limit, and we've done that for the last couple of years. Just to go back, I forgot about in terms of the blink monitoring. When we put that system in, I was able to then stop doing pupil progress meetings and book looks as additional activities, because we were able to do them actually when we were in the classroom. So for pupil progress, when I go into a classroom, I might be looking at a particular group of children, and I'd sort of vary that for each blink that we do, and then we can have a discussion about that when we do the feedback. We don't hold a separate pupil progress meeting. I'm aware of the progress that the children are making. We don't need to have yet another meeting to discuss that. Book looks, I'd never now do a book look without the child or with a group of children. Certainly don't do them separately, and again that's reduced my workload too.
Wow, thanks so much to Georgina Young. What I particularly like there about what Georgina said was about meetings. How many meetings have we been to as professionals that have just been a complete waste of time when you've been sat there and thinking about all the stuff you actually have to do for the following day that you physically cannot do because you're in that space. I think it's a wonderful message from her to say we're only going to do meetings that are necessary. We're not going to have a calendared meeting, so to speak, every week. We're only going to call a meeting when it's necessary, and we're going to come up with other ideas, other ways to facilitate the time for staff to meet together. And she mentioned the Facebook group that they've set up. I think listening to that's essential listening for me, what we've just heard from Georgina. Very privileged on this podcast to not only have Georgina, but to also have Helena Marsh on the podcast. Many of you who are on social media will know Helena. She is an absolute advocate for reducing workload. She's an executive principal based in Cambridge, an English teacher and a writer. She is also the Women Ed co-founder and a member of the Heads Roundtable group. I'm really delighted that and privileged that Helena has given a bit of her time to talk on the Rebel Education podcast about her experience of reducing workload in her school.
My name's Helena Marsh and I'm Executive Principal at Linton Village College. I got involved in the DfE's workload challenge after their national survey of teachers and became a member of the Planning and Resourcing Committee that produced recommendations and a report on this particular aspect of teacher workload. My involvement in the workload challenge has led to us as a senior leadership team making teacher workload a whole school priority. We've had a concerted effort to remove unnecessary bureaucracy and tasks and to rethink some of the ways in which the three main aspects of the recommendation reports, curriculum planning and resourcing, marking and assessment and data management, were managed at our school. One of the biggest changes that we've made is the removal of whole school data drops. We felt as though the half-termly data reporting cycle became really onerous for teachers, especially those in subjects that didn't see children as frequently in Key Stage 3, and was creating an immense amount of workload in terms of assessment every half-term for certain members of the school that had lots of teaching groups. We've now moved to a departmental structure whereby heads of department decide on their own assessment calendars that build in meaningful assessment points that fit in line with their schemes of learning. This has made it far more purposeful and meaningful for members of staff to engage with. Another shift has been moving to online markbooks using the platform Go for Schools, which means that teachers can add their assessment data as and when appropriate, rather than filling in data to a whole school database. The move to online markbooks has also meant that we can do snapshot reports to parents rather than expecting teachers to fill in certain parts of data in line with our reporting cycle in the academic year, and we've been very keen to make sure that this is all integrated with the way in which teachers approach their planning and also the way in which they give feedback to students. It's taken a while for this approach to embed and to change some of the habits and cultures that have become to be the norm within secondary schools, but it's a worthwhile shift. Really, our emphasis is on maintaining quality and consistency of the quality rather than adopting, for bureaucratic purposes, a wholesale approach across the school, which in effect was completely unmanageable for many of our staff. We think that this is an important step change in the culture, in refocusing our energies and time back onto the things that actually influence learning and benefit our children, rather than producing an audit trail. And the only one point in the 5 years that children are at secondary school at Linton in which we do demand that teachers enter a predicted grade on a wholesale approach is for college applications in around the mocks of year 11. All of the other points are determined at a departmental level. Ultimately, I think teachers need to have professional trust and freedom to do what's best in their particular curriculum disciplines and within their classrooms. And shifting away from a whole school approach to things like data drops has really shown this to be happening in practice. Another change that we've instigated has been moving away from a whole school marking policy to departmental feedback policies. A number of years ago, like many schools, our feedback from Ofsted was that we needed to make feedback more consistent, and this led to a phase of using a whole school stamping approach, using what went well and even better if. While this did help in the first instance to increase the quality of the feedback that was being given and make sure that it was precise and targeted, we actually felt as though we'd outgrown that particular strategy, and we were finding, for example, pieces of art actually being ruined by being stamped in line with school policy expectations. We've now moved to a more nuanced approach where each department creates their own feedback policy that is manageable, meaningful, and follows the recommendations of the DfE's guidance. Ultimately, it's important that students know what they're doing well and how they can improve, but we don't feel as though having exactly the same technique for that in all subjects is appropriate. For example, a food teacher is going to give a huge amount of verbal feedback during a practical session in their lesson rather than needing to stamp work and respond in the same way. And also, being a small secondary school, she teaches pretty much the whole of Key Stage 3, so expecting that kind of feedback approach, which may be appropriate in other humanities-based subjects, didn't seem fair or right. So in giving departments the trust and the autonomy to decide on their own approaches to feedback that are fit for purpose in their subject areas, we have focused on the quality and impact of feedback, whatever that looks like in that particular subject area, rather than necessitating a uniformity of approach. Another distinctive change has been shifting the way we think about curriculum planning and resourcing to be about saving teachers' workload rather than creating it. I think we all recognise that teachers enjoy being creative and designing their own resources to suit their classes, but actually when you're teaching a full timetable, this just is not realistic. So we've tried to take away the stigma of teachers feeling as though they've got to produce their own individual resources, to encourage the use of textbooks and collective resource banks and make that as easy as possible. I think we're still guilty perhaps of having a reservoir of resources that teachers have to find their way through, and as a new member of staff or a newly qualified teacher, that can be overwhelming. So with Heads of Subject, we've had a real focus on making sure that the curriculum planning actually reduces teacher workload, that the best quality resources and the way to navigate them is there, so that especially our early career teachers don't feel as though they are reinventing that wheel. In our additional staff training as part of our induction, we talk about our approach to planning and resourcing at Linton Village College and use the analogy really of being a chef. We don't expect anyone to be using pot noodles, but neither do we expect Michelin star recipes. And if we can go for a Hello Fresh style approach, where actually you are supported in your department areas by giving the ingredients to help you to plan appropriate lessons rather than starting with raw ingredients from scratch, you're going to have the best possible chance of managing your planning. Ultimately, 6 minutes of PPA time per hour spent is not sufficient for teachers to have the time that they need to adequately plan and resource their lessons and assess their pupils and give feedback. So we need to be enabling our staff to be able to share what's there rather than independently trawling the internet or designing their resources from scratch. And I think that's a really important distinction, that actually curriculum planning and resourcing, if it's done well, should be reducing workload rather than creating it.
Thanks, Helena. Plenty to think about there from what Helena has just said. If you want to tweet or get involved, then please tweet at Rogers History. Subscribe to the Rebel Education podcast on iTunes or Podbean, or even if you want to, you can listen on YouTube as well through my YouTube channel, which is Rogers History. Our final guest or contributor on the podcast is the incredible Kate Owbridge, who is a head teacher, another inspirational head teacher, I must say. If you want to follow her on Twitter, she is at Kate Owbridge. That is at Kate Owbridge. She's a head teacher in Kent. She's also the chair of the Ashdown and Havens Education Improvement Partnership. Kate is a brilliant person. That's the first thing to say. And if you are on social media at all, on Twitter or whatever, then she's well worth seeking out, because she really engages in a positive way with everybody that she comes into contact with. Is real breath of fresh air on there. She is going to share with us now what she has done to reduce workload in her school. And I must say, this is a tour de force. This is another fantastic summary of what one school has done. Well, actually, I think Kate oversees a number of schools. She'll have to correct me if I'm wrong on that one. But this is a brilliant summary of what Kate has been doing and what her colleagues have been doing to reduce workload in her school. Some amazing ideas. So let's listen to Kate.
Hi Tom, Kate Owbridge here. I am taking some time out from watching the Bake Off this evening to tell you a little bit about what we've tried to do at our school to reduce teacher workload. It's 3 years since I started at my school as executive head, and when I got there, the teachers were just like they are now, very hardworking, very committed and passionate about what they do. And what we've tried to do is keep that passion, keep that commitment, but make sure they don't have to work so many hours to give it to the school and to the children. So one of the first things that we looked at was planning and marking. We wrote a new curriculum in the first year that I was at our school. When I say we, it was the senior leadership who looked at who learnt what and when they learnt it, and then the subject leaders took that on and wrote medium-term plans. And one of the reasons for us having our own schemes of work was so that teachers weren't reinventing the wheel every term. They didn't have to go over it all over again. And we took out weekly planning at that point and went from our medium-term plans that we'd written for each term, for each unit of work, for each subject, and went straight to lesson plans. We used the teacher toolkit 5-minute lesson plan format that we adapted slightly, tweaked it a little bit for our own ends, and we started using that. That had a really big impact on what we did with the children, and I think had an impact on what the staff were doing. But one of the themes that comes up with my staff time and again is that they're sometimes their own worst enemy. So where you can fill out the 5-minute lesson plan in 5 minutes if you write it with a pen, it takes much longer if you do it on a computer and type in every single box. But people wanted to do that, and I'm not going to take it away if they want to do it. So that's what we were doing. We then pulled back on marking. Everybody was marking everything in every lesson, ridiculous amounts of marking, to, again, very little impact on the children, on their future marking. So we pulled back on our marking and feedback probably 2 years ago and cut it right back to just highlighting the WALT and highlighting key skills or key things that children should have picked up on, and maybe a comment if you felt it needed it. This was much, much less than what they were doing, but it was still a lot. People just seemed to be marking all the time. So the end of last academic year, we implemented the no more marking that I've seen Claire Seeley do and talk about, and I've seen Primary Percival talk about, and we have incorporated that into our lesson plan. So we now have one sheet that has half feedback from the lesson you just taught and feeds straight into the lesson plan for the next time. Claire Seeley says the next step is the next lesson, and it's all on the same sheet for us. That has had a huge impact, not just on teacher workload, but also on how well the staff are meeting the needs of individual children. They always were doing it quite well, but I think they're doing it very well now, and that's the feedback I'm getting from the staff. Best one was when one of my year 2 teachers, Natalie, very experienced teacher, great teacher, came into my office at 5:20, when I'm going home, I've done everything for next week. She'd done all her marking, all her planning, and was off home. That's, to me, is brilliant. Another thing that we did was we pulled back on emails. I put a time limit on when we could and couldn't send emails. If people choose to read them whenever they want, they can, but they're not to respond to them unless it's within a certain time limit. And actually, I didn't do that for teacher workload. I did that for parents, really, because parents often email at all sorts of times of the day and night, which is fine. I didn't want staff responding at 9:30 at night because it sets that precedent and says to parents, you can expect to be replied to. Our parents didn't expect to be replied to at that time, but I didn't want to set that up for ourselves. So teachers suddenly started saying, well, you used to reply when I sent an email and now you're not doing it to the next day. So we just put that in place. I'm pretty sure some staff still ignore it, but they just don't email me outside of those hours. But it's there. We do try. What else have we done? Oh, this year we have streamlined our reports, our end-of-year reports, basically. We had, again, a common pattern. We had streamlined them once, so they were only a side of A4, but it's still a lot and still takes teachers a long time to write them. So we actually consulted our teaching staff, and we've decided this year to do, we were doing 2 parents' evenings a year and an end-of-year report. What we're doing this year is we're doing 3 parents' evenings in term 2, term 4 and term 6, and in term 1, term 3 and term 5, we're doing a progress printout, literally from our assessment system, a printout of where they are with an explanation of what it means, so that then when they have the parents' evening within sort of 5 or 6 weeks of receiving that, they can discuss it with the teacher, but there won't be a big fat end-of-year report. We did consult the staff on that because there aren't enough hours in the 1265 teachers' contracted hours to have a third parents' evening. So they basically had to volunteer to do it in return for not having to write an end-of-year report, which almost all of them went for. Not everybody, but almost all of them. So that's what we're doing this year, see how that goes. I would like to limit time in the building. I'd like to say they had to be chucked out at a certain time and not allowed in for a certain time. But my senior managers are key holders, so no matter how much I say you mustn't, they will still sneak in at weekends and things, which I don't like. But as one teacher said to me, if you stop me coming in at the weekend, it will stress me more that I can't come in. So I have to trust them all to do what's right for them. Not sure we've cracked that, but I've got my eye on it. And the other thing that I think we still need to cut back on is our assessments and how we manage our assessments. 3 years ago, 2 years ago, 1 year ago, our assessment system was not working. We couldn't get accurate assessments across the school. We couldn't compare them to the year before, the year after, the next door class, anything. It just wasn't working, and the governors were aware of it. We were aware of it. It was a really hard one to crack. We did crack it. We have a different system now that our current head of school for the junior site put in place, and it has really worked for us, and it enabled us to have a really tight assessment system that is accurate. When we had our Ofsted in May and they said, your data is accurate, that was one of the greatest things I could ever have heard. But it's still not right. You know, I worry that it's still levels by another name. I think there's too many data drops. I think we're expecting the children to make linear progress when actually they don't in real life. But it's a battle that we're picking later on because what we've got at the moment is working. And that's probably about it from me. What I would say is I still think the teachers are their own worst enemy, because no matter how much we try and pull it back, they try and sneak things back in. But I will keep trying because they are a great staff and they deserve a better work-life balance. And if I can give that to them, then I'll try my best to do it. And that's it. Thanks, Tom. See you soon. Bye.
Wow, what a podcast. I've been enthralled, really, to listen to all these different ideas for reducing workload, whether that be on an individual class teacher level, on a whole school level. It's been a wonderful podcast. Thank you so much to Georgina Young, Helena Marsh, and also Kate Owbridge for their incredible contributions on this podcast. I really hope it's helped you in your role, whatever that may be, to reduce your own workload, or giving you some ideas on further things you can do to cut down on the time it takes for you to do your job. Thanks very much for listening to the Rebel Education podcast. We'll be back next Thursday evening for more from the education world. With that, I'm going to sign off and say toodaloo and have a fantastic week and weekend. Cheers all. Bye.